Thank you all for being here on this morning, or maybe if you're further east, this afternoon. Uh, this is such a esoteric and super nerdy topic to be covering. And so I'm thrilled that anybody wants to talk about it. It's certainly something that I'm very interested in. And I look forward also to hearing what your questions are. To begin with, I also will say I am not a historian, right? So I'm not a historian of Aquavit, but I have lived the history at this point of the kind of rise of Aquavit in the craft distilling movement in the United States and come at it from that perspective. And also, I do love doing my research before I do anything. So before we were making Aquavit at our distillery, I certainly did a lot of deep diving into the history of Aquavit, the history of gin when we're making gin. I'm just fascinated about where things come from, why they are the way they are, where traditions come from, and how we can honor that today while also bringing things kind of up to date. So let's go to the next slide. So here's what we're going to talk about today. So this is called The Rise of Aquavit in the United States, but I'm actually going to start earlier because I think this is a really interesting puzzle of how these pieces come together that definitely includes more of the history of medicine, the history of distillation, the history of Aquavit in Scandinavia, and different ways it came to the United States. So we're going to talk about that before we also then touch on craft distilling and craft cocktails in the United States, which really has created the avenue for increased interest in Aquavit today. So those are the topics we're going to cover. And hopefully by the end, you will see how they have all knit together into kind of a fun story, and a story that is still absolutely being told, because even today we've had our distillery. We opened in 2013. So we have been producing Aquavit since 2014. And when we first started, by far the most frequent question we got was, what is Aquavit? Now, 10, 11 years later, the most frequent question we get is, what is Aquavit? So it is still a relatively unfamiliar spirit in the United States, but it's becoming more and more familiar to people. And we are now also getting the question, tell me about your Aquavit, or what's your favorite Aquavit cocktail, almost as much as the question, what is Aquavit? So that to me really indicates an increase in the awareness of Aquavit outside of just Scandinavian populations. So let's go to the next slide to be able to talk about Aquavit. Let's first talk about what Aquavit is, or how it's defined, because it is a spirit that really grew out of a whole variety and class of spirits. But the way we see it today, and what we're talking about when we talk about Aquavit, is specific, and it is specifically defined. It's actually, I think, well, it's defined pretty similarly in the different countries that produce Aquavit. So it has to be spirit-based, but the spirit that it is distilled from, or the base for the distillation, can be different things depending on where you are. In Norway, Aquavit has to be distilled mainly from Norwegian potatoes. So they are kind of the most strict. In Norway, Aquavit also has to be aged, usually for at least a year. The age depends on the size of the casks that it's being aged in. This is different in Sweden, in Denmark, and in the United States, where Aquavit can be distilled from anything and is in fact usually distilled from grain. From there, the thing that defines Aquavit as Aquavit is the infusion. It has to be infused with either caraway, the spice caraway, or dill seed, or it can be infused with both. From there, it can also have additional botanicals. And so that's the way that different national styles of Aquavit have come about, as well as the differences in styles that you'll see from distillers in the United States. So caraway really gives it kind of like rye bready flavor. Dill would give it a very fresh dill herbal flavor. But there are also differences depending on what the Aquavit is going to be used for. So in Norway, as you can see, these are photos from the Vinmonopol in Norway just this summer. There are tons of different styles, and the same can be said in Sweden. I haven't gone Aquavit shopping in Denmark, so I guess I don't actually know. But in Norway, There is Aquavit for eating with shellfish. There is Aquavit for eating with mountain food. There is Aquavit for drinking in the summer. There's Aquavit for Christmas. And the same can be said in other places. In the United States, it has tended to be more limited, and most American distillers tend to have very caraway forward Aquavit. And so that's kind of, we're going to get into that a little bit later, but that's a very interesting fact from which Aquavits were imported into the United States and what people were familiar with. But that's also changing because people in the United States love to mess with things and add different ingredients, including us. Like we add cardamom, we add ginger, we add all sorts of baking spices to make a warmer, easier to use Aquavit. So next slide, let's start at the very beginning before we go any further of where this all came from. So one of the reasons I love spirits and making spirits is they have this incredible rich history, and it's generally a medicinal history. So let's start even before distilling. Let's start with fermentation. And fermentation is where alcohol comes from in the first place. And so to be able to make something distilled, first you have to make something that's fermented. And fermentation comes from when yeast eats available sugars and makes alcohol as a byproduct. So fermentation has been around since pre-recorded history. Yeast is probably the oldest domesticated organism of all. And when people throughout history were making fermentations in oh my gosh, I'm forgetting my numbers, but in very, very early history, from very early history, we know that as people started trying to treat disease and injury various ways, they discovered that alcohol was useful. They discovered that it was useful for sterilizing cuts and sanitizing things, and actually what could be very healing. But based on the interest in like the humors and the idea of humoral medicine and balancing the different temperaments, people thought disease was due to imbalances of temperament mainly. And so maybe you were bilious, or maybe you were too sanguine and you needed to balance this out. And so they used different herbs and spices to balance the humors. And they would infuse these herbs and spices into the various things that they were fermenting. In Southern Europe, this tended to be grapes. We know that in Scandinavia, the same things were being done, and they were fermenting beer mainly from grain. And we have evidence of that from like the Viking sagas, but we know the Vikings also drank wine. These spices and through the spice trade were moving all over the place. So distillation was discovered separately in China and in the Middle East by alchemists. And they were trying to take the essence of various things and capture that essence through distillation. And distillation is the process of boiling something, capturing the vapors and turning the vapors back into liquid. And so these alchemists and then these kind of medieval doctors thought that they were capturing the spirit of whatever it was they were distilling, which is where the word spirits for distilled liquid actually comes from now. And so they figured if you wanted the courage of a bear, you could put the heart of a bear in alcohol and distill it, and the resulting liquid would give you the courage of a bear. So the same could be said, they thought, for these various spices and herbs. And so they started putting all the herbs and spices that they were using medicinally infused into wine or beer into these distillations and distilling them off. And that gave rise to all sorts of spirits that were being used against everything from the plague to gout to indigestion to snake bite to my favorite was that was also used to cure hypochondria. And a lot of this was done by early doctors. Then it was transferred to like monks and monasteries, where a lot of spirits like that we know of now, chartreuse and amari and things like that, were made in monasteries because the monks were also kind of responsible for being the bringers of medicine to their various towns. So this really originated in Southern Europe, but we also know that it made its way to Scandinavia. So let's go to the next slide and talk about Aquavit coming into Scandinavia. a lot of the history of spirits, cocktails, everything is murky. And it has to be pieced together. But we do have a very clear first reference to Aquavit coming to Scandinavia. It was probably being used there before, but this is the first reference. Aquavit's presence in Scandinavia was described in a letter from the Danish Lord Eskebille, and he sent a letter to the Bishop Olav Engelbrektsson, and this is in 1531. And he talks about how they're shipping in this amazing substance that could be used to cure absolutely everything. And he called it, truly, it is the aquavitae. And aquavitae is Latin for water of life. And so this, again, really refers to this idea that these spirits with infusions had medicinal properties that were incredibly curative. So at this time, we don't know exactly which herbs and spices were in the aquavitae that were being imported to Scandinavia. But it was probably a lot of the same things that we see today in current aquavit, but also in gin, in chartreuse, and all these other things. We also know that with some resurgence of the plague, that the various princes and bishops asked their doctors and their leading apothecaries to create more aquavitae for Scandinavians to try to fight against the plague. And so one of the people who was really instrumental in doing this was Princess Anna of Sachsen, who was a Danish princess. And she spent her life developing hundreds and hundreds of recipes for aquavitae contra, I can't even remember the Latin word for illness, but these aquavitaes against different illnesses. And so she was likely one of the first people who was using really more Scandinavian herbs and spices in these aquavitae, because we know that a lot of these spirits were infused with things that were imported from the spice trade, but caraway itself, which is the most important spice in today's aquavit, and as well as dill, are also native to Scandinavia, native to Northern Europe. And so it is recorded as being grown in Scandinavian gardens as early as like 1000 AD. And so we know that this is probably when some of these recipes started incorporating these more Scandinavian spices. So she created at least 181 different recipes for aquavit, but they were all destroyed. None of them survived past her death. So we don't know exactly what the recipes were. But we do know that home distillation of aquavit became popular during the same time because people were learning to distill on their own. In the 1500s, 1600s, distillation was taught to people by people who had brought the skill to Scandinavia, actually to create spirits for cleaning guns, but they discovered that they could use these same techniques for the home-produced aquavit. And another person to whom the real growth of aquavit and the popularization of aquavit in Scandinavia is attributed to is Christopher Blixhammer. He's even called the father of Norwegian aquavit. And so he was somebody who really believed, it's funny because he really believed in temperance. He really believed in not drinking too much, but he also really believed in teaching various skills. He was kind of an intellectual. He studied mathematics, theology, law, but he believed in bringing these skills to the general Scandinavian public. And so he's called Norwegian. You have to remember that through all these years, Norway, Denmark, Sweden were basically one country, constantly trading around where the seat of power was. So he's Norwegian, but it was all kind of one big country. And so he was a real advocate for teaching the process of distillation to farmers. And we have detailed tomes that he wrote about how to distill aquavit. And he was of the opinion that drinking liquor was necessary for health, still considered medicinal. And it was especially necessary he didn't drink himself, interestingly, but he felt that it was especially necessary for farmers and people working in the woods. They had to be able to have aquavit and beer, but especially aquavit when you had to get up at 2, 3 in the morning to go out in the dark to tend the fields. So there's a priceless quote from him in one of his writings where he says that is too early for beer. I'd rather have a glass of aquavit. So aquavit is still considered very medicinal, very necessary, but it also is becoming very popular with people for the warm, fuzzy feelings, let's say, that it is giving them. Around this time, also, we see the transition in Norway itself, less so in Sweden and Denmark, for kind of just economic reasons that I'm not 100% clear on, but we see it in Norway, the transition to potatoes. And so potatoes really take hold as an agricultural product in Norway. And there's actually a Swedish noblewoman named Eva Ekerblad who first decided to try to produce spirits from potatoes rather than grain, and it was highly successful. And so that became the preferred method for fermenting and distilling in Norway, whereas in Denmark and Sweden, it really remained grain-based. So then overall this time, we'll go to the next slide. Overall this time, Aquavit is still being used medicinally, but it is also transitioning to being used as a celebration drink, which is more of how I think all of us think of it today. And so for the 18th century, from the 16th to the 18th century, the consumption of hard liquor in Scandinavia kind of grew and grew in popularity, similar to in the rest of Europe. This is actually the time when we see like the issues with gin overconsumption in England and in the Netherlands and kind of some of society going to pot. But in the Scandinavia is really interesting because there were these strong beliefs that it was actually necessary to get drunk at celebrations, especially weddings and funerals. You can see one of these pictures is a wedding celebration, and the middle one is actually some people making their own home distillation. And it was the purview of women to be the brewers and the distillers for many of the years until the 1800s. But it was considered necessary to get drunk. We even see this in like religious writings from various priests, that this was how you got close to God during weddings and funerals and at Christmas. So you have the introduction of Aquavit to these festival occasions because it was a very quick and easy way to get spiritually drunk and actually drunk during this time. So it became a very popular celebration drink, and it remained so until the Norwegian temperance or the Scandinavian temperance movement, which happened kind of at the same time as the crackdown on gin in England. So we're seeing both the use of alcohol as a very popular thing for celebrations. We're seeing it medicinally, and then we're also seeing people raising some flags and saying, hey, this is becoming out of control because it is rampant. Every household has their own still. It's being overconsumed. And so in the late 1800s, we see both some economic declines that put a stop to some of the distillation because it's harder to get and afford the raw materials for using it, but also crackdowns and temperance movements saying like, maybe we shouldn't consume this much. Maybe we should centralize the distillation and limit it to only one distillery per parish was the law, at least in Norway. And so we see this centralization happening. Interestingly, at the same time, we're allowing for improvements in distillation technique to make spirits that are cleaner, safer. You're less likely to go blind from methanol poisoning, things like that. But even through the 1800s and into the 1900s, Aquavit in Scandinavia is still considered a medicinal drink, even while it's also becoming more and more integrated into the celebrations. And so even while Aquavit is considered an absolute necessity at Christmas, at midsummer, things like that, even into the mid-1900s, in a lot of Scandinavia, Aquavit was still sold in apotek, which is the pharmacy. And it was given time rations during World War I. Everybody was allowed to have 16 ounces per consultation with the pharmacist. And so And even through prohibition in the Scandinavians also, they had a prohibition similar to in the United States, but you could still get it prescribed to you by a pharmacist because it was also still medicine. And another just little fun fact that I think is hilarious is that it was also considered medicine for animals during this time, the mid-1900s. And so while people were limited to 16 ounces per consultation, there was no limit for animals. And you could get like 10 liters at a time for your horses or your cows if they were having issues. And so pharmacists did a brisk business in selling Aquavit for the cows and horses of Scandinavia during Prohibition, which was probably not going to the cows and horses of Scandinavia during Prohibition. So post-Prohibition, we see this kind of general cultural shift, both in the United States and in Europe, away from seeing spirits as primarily medicinal to primarily for enjoyment. And that's where we really see Aquavit as being mainly used for, as it was before, celebrations like weddings, funerals, Christmas, midsummer, all kind of the high holy celebrations. So meanwhile, next slide, let's turn to what's happening in the United States. Because during this time, we have something that is going to eventually make Aquavit more popular in the United States, which is the craft cocktails. And we do know that in the United States, Aquavit was present as early as the 1800s, coming with Scandinavian immigrants. And we have references from like old newspapers saying that you could find this, they called it like the most strong spirit outside of some particular type of rum that you could possibly find, and you would find it in any enclave of Norwegian immigrants. But as with many things, that was also shut down during Prohibition and had to see a resurgence later. But in the United States gives birth to something known as the cocktail, which it's seen as kind of a uniquely American invention. It really isn't. It, of course, came from somewhere. The cocktail really was born out of a history of punch and then toddies, which were popular in Europe, popular in the Caribbean, very popular among sailors, which is these mixed drinks that had spirits in them. But what the cocktail was itself, it's first referred to in a newspaper in New York in the early 1800s as something to like perk you up, to cock up your tail as though you were a racing horse. And it was considered to be a mixture of spirits, sugar, water, and bitters. And so that was the first thing that was referred to as a cocktail. So during the 1800s, the cocktail becomes exceptionally popular in the United States, and creative bartenders start to experiment with that basic formula of spirit, water, bitters, and sugar, and add different things to it. So they start improving, making things they called improved cocktails with the addition of vermouth, with the addition of absinthe, with various liqueurs, orange liqueur, grenadine, which creates this whole canon of classic cocktails that we still use and are familiar with today, from what we call an old-fashioned, which was the original thing that was referred to as a cocktail, to the Manhattan, to the Martini, French 75s, bee's knees, like all these old sours, margaritas even, all these old classic cocktails. So cocktail consumption was pushed into hiding during Prohibition, and then it truly came on dark times during the First and Second World War, when ingredients became very hard to come by because of rationing. But we saw a resurgence in cocktails in the 50s and 60s that was then wiped away with what we in the cocktail and distilling industry consider the cocktail dark ages of the 1980s and 1990s. And this really came about because of the industrialization of the food system, as well as the industrialization of spirits productions and the kind of like mass commodification of ingredients that we saw really start after World War II, but that really took hold in the United States in the 80s and 90s, and everything became really packaged. And that was true of spirits, and that was true of cocktail mixers too. And probably everybody here remembers the disgusting, or maybe you love them. No shade to anybody who loves them, but like, you know, fake sour mixes and neon colored juices and things like that, that were popular in drinks in the 1980s and 1990s. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, first bartenders kind of rediscovered the classic cocktails from the pre-prohibition era. The old fashions, the Manhattans, really started to come back in vogue, along with the bartenders that had the curly mustaches and the aprons and things like that. And as people became more interested in these more kind of old-fashioned thinking cocktails, people also became more interested in some of the more obscure liqueurs and vermouths and things that went into them. So starting in the 2000s and up till now, we see just more and more interest in more and more obscure ingredients and more kind of botanical ingredients. So people have become interested in absinthe. People have become interested in chartreuse. They are willing to have those things in their cocktails, and that also goes for Aquavit. So we'll go to the next slide, because following a similar trajectory, we have distilling in the United States, because the other thing that's been really necessary for Aquavit to become made and popular in the United States is the rise of craft distilling. And so I thought this is a really interesting little graph that you see up here, which is the number of licensed distilleries in the United States. So similar to in Europe, the United States had a lot of small, often home distilleries before Prohibition. It was really, really widespread. Before Prohibition, there were 2,000 distilleries across the country. In the United States, Prohibition really succeeded in cracking down on the actual number of distilleries a lot more than across Europe. So Europe continued to have more producers of more different obscure things, whereas in the United States, only 6 distilleries survived Prohibition. But, similar to the pharmacists in Scandinavia making Aquavit for medicine, the distilleries that survived Prohibition in the United States were making medicinal whiskey. And so we see these similar trajectories, but there's just this absolute bottlenecking of the production of spirits in the United States. And you can only get a few products. There's only a few products made. And that really has remained the case for 50 years. We also saw after Prohibition a real bottlenecking of the distribution system for spirits. And that actually remains the case today as well, where alcohol it can be made by a producer, and then it has to be sold to a distributor and then sold to a retailer. And this called 3-tier system was really, really, really strictly enforced until the 1980s, when a few states started making some exceptions to the rules. But because of this strictly enforced 3-tier system, it meant that only really large distilleries and only really large distributors could survive kind of economically. It only made sense to be really large. And so this really limited the number and types of spirits that people had access to. And because the large distributors are the same people who are the importers, it also really limited what was imported to the United States. And so through this time when Aquavit started being imported to the United States again, which I don't have an exact year, but was probably in like the 80s, we really only had access to 3 main kind of larger Aquavits, all sold, actually made by the same company, the same big company in Scandinavia, even though they have different brands, and sold by one big company in the United States. And so the only things that were available in the United States were Linja Aquavit from Norway, Aalborg from Denmark, and then Ope Andersson from Sweden. And so that was what most Americans were familiar with as they were trying to maintain kind of their Scandinavian celebration traditions, were just those 3. So in the 1980s, California, being, kind of its own country, and it's often doing its own things legislatively, relaxed some of the 3-tier system laws. I think because distillers started pushing to be regulated a little bit more similarly to wineries. And California, of course, has a huge wine industry. And so they made changes and they had a huge craft brewing industry. So they made changes to distilling that echoed some of that and allowed for a slight different licensing fees for distilleries, different direct sales laws. And so the very first craft distilleries that started appearing in the United States were in the early 1980s. And the movement was really led by St. George, which is still around, and then Charbet, which has been bought, and Germain Robin, which has also been bought by a larger company. But they really kind of like cracked open the idea of a small distillery being something that could exist again in the United States, and the idea that maybe American consumers would be interested in some more artisanal spirits instead of just the really, really big brands. But it still wasn't for a number of more years that craft distilling began to grow more rapidly. And this, again, is all due to legislation and how long it can take for legislation to get changed. So it really wasn't until the 2010s, the 20-teens, where one by one states started looking at California, looking at what had started happening in Washington, Oregon, Colorado were kind of the first, New York were kind of the first to push for changes to allow for smaller scale companies to distill again. And these changes tend to be things like allowing distillers, if they're under a certain size, to maybe sell directly to stores and restaurants, or sell directly to their customers. Like you may be able to go to, like you can go to a winery and buy bottles directly from the winery. In Minnesota, that's still barely legal for distilleries, right? But in many states, a craft distillery would also be able to like sell you a case of spirits directly because they're under a certain size, or be able to distribute themselves because they're under a certain size. And so as the legislation, and it's different state by state, all these exemptions to the three-tier system increase, that has allowed for the increase of craft distilling and for more and more craft distilleries to be located in each state. So when we started distilling back in 2013, there were still only about 40 or 50 craft distillers across the country, and now there's like 5,000. So these changes in legislation have really allowed for a lot more small companies to exist. It's still extremely challenging because it's still really, really dominated by the large distributors and by the large producers, who also will like buy anybody that they see as actual legitimate competition. But it has allowed for this diversification of distilling, which has allowed for people to experiment a little bit more with what types of products are being made and bring more interesting things into the spirit lexicon for Americans. So next slide, how does this all relate to the appearance of Aquavit in the United States? So as I was saying, there were really only, with these big companies doing the importing, there were really only 3 brands of Aquavit that were imported to the United States. And because they're focused on sales and on volume, these big companies, they were also really only imported to places that had very high Scandinavian populations. So you would see them imported to Minnesota, you would see them imported to Washington, you would see them imported actually to Texas, because Houston has one of the largest Norwegian populations outside of Norway because of oil. And so you'd see these pockets of it, but it still wasn't very common. But Scandinavian immigrants, people upholding the Scandinavian tradition, still did want to have their bottle of Aquavit maybe in the freezer for Christmas and, have it just then. Everybody's grandpa would force it on them, right? Is what I hear from people. But in 2006, there were importation issues with Aquavit into the United States. And so suddenly it wasn't possible to get, I think, any of these Aquavits for many people. I think O.P. Anderson was completely taken away, and it might just be starting to come back to the United States. But you also couldn't get Oberg or Linja. And Christian Krogstad is a person we know through distilling, met him way back when we were starting, but he is of Scandinavian descent, living in Portland, Oregon, and he discovered that he couldn't get Aquavit anymore. And, had a little panic attack, because what do you do with Christmas without Aquavit? How are you supposed to cut the fat? How are you supposed to have that digestive aid? And because he had his own small distillery in Portland called House Spirits, he wasn't making Aquavit at the time, but he was like, well, why not make my own Aquavit, because I can't get any, and maybe I'll figure this out. So he decided to make his own Aquavit, and his was really maybe the first more widely available Aquavit produced by a craft distiller in the United States. His is very kind of star anise forward. It's very licoricey, so it's a little bit less of that carry tradition. He made it and just first wasn't selling it commercially at all, but he had his own stash and he had it available in his tasting room. And what he discovered was that the people who were the most attracted to it were the craft cocktail movement leaders, the people who were really passionate about bringing more interesting cocktails into their bars. So the cool kid bartenders were all like, what is this cool thing? It seems really esoteric. We want to be able to buy it. And because of that interest, he started to sell it through distribution. And it might be the biggest craft producer of Aquavit in the country. And so with this interest in Aquavit that was rising in craft cocktail bars, as more small distilleries started to open up and started to produce their own spirits, more and more of them thought of Aquavit as a potential thing to make. And when you are running a distillery, a lot of the distilleries in the United States, the craft distilleries started wanting to make whiskey. Whiskey is a product where you have to have a huge investment because you're putting it away and letting it age. So most distilleries also have to make some unaged products. And those can be things like liqueur, that can be vodka, which is what most people were going for in the 2010s. But craft distilleries also really started making more gin and more interesting gin. That was one of the things we did because it's a creative spirit and it doesn't have to be aged. And the same goes for Aquavit. It can be aged, but it doesn't have to be aged. And so a few distilleries like us getting started in 2013, our friend Mike of Gamle he lives in Minnesota, but he was distilling in Wisconsin. The guys at North Shore in Illinois all started making Aquavit as one of our unaged spirits as well. And most of the people still at this time who were making Aquavit were doing so because they had some connection to Scandinavia. They had some Norwegian heritage. My mom's from Norway, grew up spending part of the year every year in Norway. So I was familiar with it. That's why we wanted to make it. But again, a lot of the ability to actually sell it outside of people who were looking for it because their grandparents had always had it and they wanted to have it at their Scandinavian celebrations was really driven by the interest of bartenders. And so you can get your Aquavit into bars and restaurants for people who want to make cocktails that are like similar to a gin cocktail, but that have a new twist. And so a few of the bars in Minnesota were really interested in pushing Aquavit cocktails. Bars in Seattle and Portland were really interested in pushing Aquavit cocktails. And then there are a couple of real leaders in New York too, including Death and Company, who is one of the kind of big leaders of really creating what like we expect from craft cocktails in a high-end craft cocktail bar today. They were big advocates for including Aquavit in cocktails. And so it became more and more visible on cocktail menus, which then in turn led to more and more craft distilleries thinking, maybe I should do my own take on Aquavit. And so there are now also more people who own craft distilleries who decided to make Aquavit, not because they're Scandinavian, but because they saw it in a bar, they thought it was really cool, they wanted to try it themselves, they thought it was really botanically interesting. And so people tend to be inspired by the very caraway forward Aquavits that they have had, maybe the Linea or the Olborg or some of these original ones, but American Aquavits tend to incorporate also more anise flavors, more fennel flavors, more citrus flavors, and really play with the flavor profile a little bit. I thought it was really funny when we were starting our distillery and the North Shore guys are also making Aquavit, North Shore Aquavit. They were making it with cumin, which is a mistake that a few American distilleries made, or it doesn't have to be seen as a mistake, but it was a mistake in that it was a mistranslation because in Swedish and in German, some of these old recipes that you look at, the word for caraway contains the word cumin in it. And so people thought that they were intending to use cumin in the recipe instead of caraway, but it's actually intended to be caraway. But it gave rise to a few cumin-inflected Aquavits, which some people really like in a Bloody Mary. So there's a person, Jacob Greer. I can't remember. I've met him a couple of times, but now I can't remember how to say his last name. Hopefully he's not in this webinar. If you are, hi, Jacob. Was interested in this growth of Aquavit in the United States, and he really wanted to promote it as a person with a Scandinavian immigrant descent himself, out in Oregon, where he was seeing some of these really early creators of American Aquavits. And so he decided to found something called Aquavit Week and continue to really promote Aquavit's use in bars and restaurants, first just in Portland, but then picked up in Seattle and started doing it a few events across the country. I've been to his events in Minneapolis before, and really introduce more, I'm like on a mission to introduce more bartenders and more people to Aquavit seasoned cocktails. And so if you look at his site, he has an Aquavit Week site, and he keeps a compiled list of the number of producers and the number of Aquavits that you can get in the United States. And on his site, he says that in 2012, there were about 10 Aquavit producers, and now they're around 50, probably more at this point. And so it really is something where it's still, you compare that to the thousands of distilleries that are in the United States at this point. It's still not a huge product, but it is definitely something that has grown. And it has grown enough that when you look at Linea, which is still one of probably the most widely sold imported Aquavit, Arcus, who is a producer of Linea and of Olberg Aquavit, actually both, is looking at introducing some more of the Norwegian style more complex Aquavits into the American market, specifically for using in cocktails as well. So it's something that's really growing. And I think what is especially also fascinating about this is that this American use of Aquavit in cocktails has informed how Scandinavians are using Aquavit, because in Scandinavia, it's traditionally a celebration drink. It also was traditionally just taken as a shot. This is one of our bartenders, Jesse, demonstrating the proper way to shoot a glass of Aquavit, where you make eye contact, you do a little skull, you drain it in one gulp, and then you make eye contact again. This is supposedly originated with the Vikings, making sure that they were keeping an eye on people, making sure they weren't going to get attacked even while they were drinking together. But it's still considered just good Aquavit drinking etiquette. However, in Scandinavia, this use of Aquavit also has created, we'll call them like college style feelings about Aquavit, right? Which I think many people in the United States might have about gin or tequila or whatever they had a really bad experience with at some point in college, and the smell just makes them sick. There are definitely even Scandinavians who feel that way. And I have this really fun book, Aquavit, which has a lot of different Scandinavian Aquavit cocktails in it. And the writers of it are a couple of Norwegian and Danish bartenders who are on a mission to reclaim good feelings about Aquavit, because it is the national spirit of Scandinavia, by introducing this American approach to integrating Aquavit into cocktails more widely in Scandinavia. And so we do also see in Scandinavia, which did not have as rich of a tradition of mixing interesting drinks as the United States, a real inspiration from these craft cocktails in their own Scandinavian ingredients, and integrating those together to make more interesting cocktails and really bring Aquavit into, I don't want to call it the modern era, but like really make sure that Aquavit is staying relevant and not in any way being like having the traditions be lost, but also not having the traditions become old and dusty. And so that kind of really puts us where we are today, where Aquavit is still considered an esoteric ingredient. It is still something that you're not going to find in most bars and restaurants, but it is also something that, as you can see, has increased fivefold in the United States in the last 10 or so years, and continues to be a source of inspiration and interest for bartenders and for distillers. So that's kind of my spiel about the history of Aquavit and how it became more and more of a thing in the United States, and still could become even more of a thing. And I hope that everybody who's here will continue to promote its use. If you're looking for easy ways to use Aquavit, it's often just used in place of gin in a gin cocktail, and you can try that as kind of a first step for seeing how you like it in cocktails. It will give a gin cocktail more of like a savory flavor to it. I also really like using Aquavit in tropical cocktails instead of rum, which is something that you'll see across the United States, because caraway goes really, really well with things like pineapple and coconut. But if people have questions, let's ask some questions.
Yeah, well, that was
a lot of information
or anything. I wanted to give you your own moment. Well, first off, I have to say thank you so much for such a wonderful webinar. I had quite a few people ask, actually, in the questions and in the chat, like, this will be available later, right? This is so much information, they want to be able to see it again. So just wanted to let everybody know, yes, This will be available later on the YouTube page for the Vesterheim YouTube channel. You will get an email, just like how we sent out the email with the access to the Zoom link, that will have a link to that YouTube video. The first question that popped up, as I will remind everybody in the chat, in the program right now, that the Q&A function is now open, but I will be checking both the chat and the Q&A. Does Vikre Distillery or Duluth in general, do they celebrate Aquavit Week?
We have not had an Aquavit event in Duluth. Jacob has not come up to Duluth, I think, because it's not a big enough place. But I think it's something, and it also is something where Aquavit Week was stopped during COVID. And so Jacob's just getting it started back up again. Now I think last year was the first time that he started doing it again. So I think going forward, we'll look into celebrating it a little bit more, because I do think Duluth now, even though it's a small town, it has a lot of great restaurants, and most of the restaurants do have some, and bars do have some Aquavit on their menu somewhere. And so it would be great to bring attention to it. So I think it's something that we haven't done, but that we totally should do. And every week is Aquavit Week at Vikre Distillery. It is a running joke at the distillery with our bartenders that we have to work really hard to write cocktail menus that aren't all Aquavit cocktails, because it's all of our bartenders' favorite spirit to work with.
And I do have to say that it is always fun to be a part of those cocktail classes that you do online, to see what you guys can do with the Aquavit as well. So I'm sure if people can find Aquavit Week close to them, they should go and just have a good time. One question that did pop up, is there a wide variety of flavor like gins, or is it like caraway, cardamom, dill? Is that where it's at, or is there more?
So it tends to be so if you go to Norway and go to the liquor store, you'll see shelves and shelves and shelves of Aquavit, and they are pretty widely varied. You'll see them infused with apple. You'll see them infused with berries. You'll see them infused with vanilla. So you get a wide variety of flavor. I would say we haven't replicated that in the United States yet. So there is increasing variety because there are more craft distillers making it, and more of them are saying, hey, similar to gin, this has to be punctuated by caraway or dill, but I can do other unique things with it. But I think because most distillers are less familiar with Aquavit and where it comes from, they don't feel kind of the the confidence to say, I'm going to totally make this my own. They tend to replicate the more well-known styles like Oldberg and like Linja a little bit more. But that's definitely changing. We pushed that with ours. We made kind of a softer, more cocktail forward, like cocktail usable style. And we see other people doing that a little bit more too. And I've also seen a couple of distilleries who have gone the route of infusing more unexpected ingredients, like our friends at Tattersall, who do a coconut infused Aquavit, drawing on this idea that we popularized with Aquavit being a good fit for tropical cocktails.
Oh, yeah, there's I just had a question pop in. Someone on a Vesterheim tour in Norway, they, as a sheephead meal chaser, which was very much needed, what type of pairings would you suggest for that?
For sheep's heads or for Aquavits? I'm guessing
probably the Aquavits to go
probably
along.
For the Aquavits, right? So I think it depends on how you use them. Again, if you're putting them into a cocktail, I would let some of the other ingredients in the cocktail do some of the driving with what you're going to pair it with. But if you're sipping Aquavit or using it as a chaser, it is usually best paired with rich fatty foods, because the caraway is so good at cutting the fat. It actually, science has shown, it really is a digestive aid. They weren't totally off base when people started using it medicinally, right? And so it goes really well with smoked meats. It goes really well with pork-based dishes and lamb-based dishes, kind of heavier, meatier, very traditionally Scandinavian dishes. It goes really well with that. Or think of anything that a rye bread would be good with. So deli meats, cabbage, If you get some of the lighter aquavits, or certainly the dill ones, those go amazingly with seafood. Have herring and dill aquavit, or shrimp and a light aquavit. But I would also say that, yeah, for some of like our aquavit goes really well with seafood as well, because it is kind of light and aromatic. But then if you're putting it in a cocktail with citrus, like with a lot of lemon or something, you could try pairing it with a creamy pasta, because you're going to have that cooling caraway that helps with the digestion of something heavy, but you have the lemon that also goes with the creaminess. And so you can kind of mess around with your pairings based on exactly how you're using it. Have an Aquavit Manhattan instead of dessert, or with dessert with some chocolate paired.
Well, we did just get a suggestion for an Aquavit Bloody Mary, or as they like to call it, a Bloody Matilda.
Ooh, Bloody Matilda. We've always called it a Bloody Viking, but I like Bloody Matilda as well. But yes, Bloody Marys with Aquavit are very excellent.
Does Vikre do shipping, or would they have to buy it directly from a store?
You'd have to buy it from a store. We don't do shipping. So the way it works is that distilleries are still not allowed to ship directly. So not like we're still not like wineries yet with that type of legislative piece. Some distilleries do have shipping because they have signed on with these third-party systems that basically are coordinating the shipping from a distributor to a liquor store that's allowed to ship. And so you kind of have to find liquor stores that are allowed to ship. And we just haven't invested in working with one of those because it's a really high monthly fee. That's some insider baseball there. High monthly fees, you have to ship a lot. There are certain stores that carry our product that I think can ship. The main one is called Aces Fine Wine and Spirits, and they're Minnesota based, and they do tend to ship to all the states that allow shipping of hard spirits, which is, again, like 48 states allow shipping of wine, but I think it's only like 18 that allow shipping of spirits.